Long before airlines started to equip their aircraft with movie screens, passengers could always browse through the in-flight magazine. In fact, for millions of passengers on non-IFE equipped aircraft, the in-flight magazine is still the only form of entertainment provided by the airline, apart from, that is, the sight of passengers trying to open those fiddly little packets of pretzels. In a short space of time, Inc. has become the market leader in this field with more than 30 airlines signed up. Here to share the secrets of his success is their CEO, Jeffrey O'Rourke. Jeffrey, pleasure to have you here on the POE interview. Thanks for coming along. You've really kind of cornered the market these days in in-flight magazines. Why do you think that is?
Well, I don't know if we've cornered the market. We probably think there's about 300 airlines in the world that we'd like to work for, and we have about 30 of them, or a little over 30 of them. So we do a lot of them, but there's a lot more we'd like to do. I think that in terms of our ability to get it that far, I think it's a lot about having the editorial and sales capability in multiple countries. Probably our big watershed moment was when we figured out that we didn't have to wait for other British airlines to come along, and those would be our next step. We figured out we could pitch airlines in America or in Australia or in China, and that I think that combined that sort of ability to think outside what was considered to be our own market, as well as the ability to produce content and advertising around the world is a big part of it.
And how many people do you employ?
Just over 280.
Yeah, and in terms of how those split between sales and editorial and marketing, how does it work?
Well over half are salespeople, so we have about 150 salespeople. We have probably on the creative side about 100 people, and then we have 30 people that sort of do various things or fly around or whatever, meet clients and stuff like that. So the finance and admin and all that stuff.
And from your perspective, which is the biggest challenge to delivering a good magazine?
I think you have to understand the audience. So I think that for us, the most important audience is probably the airline. So without the airline, these magazines don't exist. So you really have to understand what they need to achieve, because they're not doing it just to entertain their passengers. They have their own objectives. Understanding what the advertisers want in terms of what sort of positioning for the magazine is going to appeal to them, given that they thereby fund the magazine. I mean, they make the magazine self-funding and revenue generating for the airlines. And then obviously the passengers as well. You need to consider who they are, where they're flying from and to. If you took a passenger for flying into London for British Airways, that's a very different passenger than a passenger flying on Lufthansa. They just have a different view on London. So you have to understand what they're going to be interested in as much as you have to understand the airline and the advertisers.
What are the toughest issues in terms of convincing advertisers that this is a good market?
I think most advertisers get it. I think generally if the magazines have been sold properly and represented properly, advertisers generally understand them.
Now, you managed to have created and built up a whole industry of in-flight magazines based around ad sales. That's where your revenue comes from. You give ad revenue to airlines. Many people have tried to do that with video, with TV advertising, and yet it hasn't really taken off. Why do you think that is?
I mean, I think about that quite a bit, actually, and I've been thinking about that in advance of this conference again. And I think there's a couple of things. I think that one problem is that the variety of IFE systems, which is bewildering to me as a person that's somewhat involved in the industry. I don't know if you feel that way, but I mean, all these different platforms and different ages of platforms, different capabilities. It's essentially complexity. And complexity is toxic to advertising. You really just need to have a very simple product, like it's going to be on all the planes in every seat. That's kind of the extent of sophistication that you need with the product. All the sort of segmentation between first and business and economy, different planes flying on different routes, that makes it a very difficult market. It's just too complex, or in some respects too complex for advertisers. Also, I think you'll find that a lot of the airlines that are the most advanced airlines in terms of IFE, and forgive me if I miss any out here, but I'm thinking like Emirates or SQ or Cathay or somebody like that. They are often in very small domestic markets. You know, the biggest ad markets in the world are like the United States, Japan, China, the UK, Germany. But most of the IFE appears on flights that is leaving the country. So if you're an airline like CX or SQ that's flying, you know, not more than 20% of its passengers are domestic, well then when you're selling advertising, the advertisers are saying, well, who am I reaching? And the advertisers are reaching 20% Singaporeans and 80% other. Mm-hmm. And that's just not effective for most advertisers.
So do you think there's anything that we can do as an industry to correct this? Is there anything that the airlines working together can do to encourage more advertisers to come on board and support the programs?
I think it's a tough one. I think that maybe if there was a way to sell it across airlines, maybe you could start to get some segmentation, some better segmentation in terms of the markets. I think it would help if the US airlines really started deploying some of the big, you know, the new systems and scale, because I think the US market it should naturally be a leading market, and in the sense that it's the biggest advertising market in the world. It has a huge domestic audience. The traffic on American carriers is much more heavily American than, for example, on SQ or Emirates or somebody like that. So it would be nice to see some really good advertising come off of the big American carriers, but of course that requires some technology or some harmonization of technology.
With the huge proliferation that we've seen in recent years of other forms of entertainment on board, do you still think the magazine has a place? After all, these airlines are flying around every day, tons and tons and tons of newsprint. It can't be environmentally very satisfactory.
Yeah, well, I mean, I definitely think they have a place. Obviously, I would say that. I mean, the one thing about our as opposed to a newspaper, our magazines tend to get reread. And I don't know, you know, how accurate any research is on this sort of stuff, but I would guess that an average copy of our magazine reaches 10 or 20 people. And that means that there's a lot of reuse going on. So I feel pretty strongly that from a use of materials point of view, that the magazines are very efficient, hyper efficient almost, probably one of the most efficient media. But I think that in terms of the readership, you know, the effectiveness of it, it's clear to me that the magazines are effective. And we see that in particular with the airlines when we're pushing in-flight retail products or consumables on board. And with the airlines that are really sensitive to this, the ones that are charging for this, when they don't have the magazines on board promoting these products, their sales fall off a cliff. And to me, that's the most definitive sign that these things are working, is when our customers are telling us, you know, our sales dropped by 30% when the magazines were taken off. And that is a really quantifiable thing. It's not some sort of qualitative guess, it's real. And for me, that's just convincing.
So where next for Inc? Obviously you're going to continue to pitch for new airline accounts, but are you branching out into any other areas? Do you see yourself as a video production company or a movie production company?
We do partner with all these companies, the sort of the people that do the service, IFE services to the airlines, and we're loyal to all of them. So we it's not an area that I think we think that market's very well served by the existing players. We've also developed a platform to put advertising on boarding passes and check-in emails, other media that we think shares the characteristic of being captive and being obligatory. So, you know, if an airline's forcing passengers to print off their boarding pass at home and take that to the airport with them, then we think that that's great, because our biggest cost is printing, and if the passenger would bear that, we would very much appreciate that.
Could you ever have too much advertising on a plane, do you think?
Definitely. I think there's a lot of wastage. I think that the airlines, I think from an airline point of view, the problem is that any incremental revenue they get from media sales is seen to be additional revenue to them, which is fine for them. However, I think that for a media company, you have to look at it and say, one, too much media is diluting the the pitch. It's just kind of, you're cheaping everything by trying to sell too much. And also, even if a media company were given an exclusive right to sell advertising for an individual airline, I would still hold that that's the case. I think there's definitely an 80-20 rule. You know, you will get 80% of the revenue from 20% of the media. And I think often we see this in pitches where the airline is pitching out its entire media platform. We see them wanting to sell anything that moves. They'll sell the tray tables, they'll sell the headrests, they'll sell the IFE, the sampling, everything, the cabin crew. They'll sell anything. And the problem is I just think that becomes a little bit desperate. And I think that if they just focused in on 1 and 2 or maybe 3 things that really work, they would increase their revenue more than having a sort of whole medicine chest of different media.
Food for thought indeed. Jeffrey, thank you very much indeed.
Thank
Appreciate
you.
your time, and it's been very interesting. Thank you.
Great, thanks.
In the next PME interview, Steve Harvey talks to Mohammed El-Assad about Gulf Air's ambitious plans to regain the status of a major carrier in the Middle East.